Hi, my name's Sara Rapuano, and I work for the Cornea service at Wills Eye Hospital in Philadelphia. A little bit about my background. I spent a number of years in finance, and at some point decided that I needed to go help my husband's cornea practice at Wills Eye, and that was 20 years ago, and I haven't left since. So over the years, taking care of finances, et cetera, within medical practice, I obviously learned corneal billing, and I spent some time working in the Wills Eye Surgery Center, and again learned a lot about billing in an ambulatory surgery setting as well as in a hospital setting, since Wills has both. So I have corneas are near and dear to my heart, and reimbursement is kind of what I do. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the insurance contracts, related to corneal transplants, and hopefully give you some tips for obtaining full reimbursement in an ambulatory surgery center or a hospital. So our objective for this meeting is to, if you give us 20 minutes, we hope we're going to give you the right questions to go back and ask your business manager to learn whether your facility is in fact obtaining appropriate reimbursement for corneal tissue. And if it's not, we hope they're going to give you some tools to negotiate with your insurance companies who aren't giving you fair reimbursement. It's a tall order, but hopefully we'll, meet some of those goals. The first question is, do you perform corneal transplants in a hospital or an ambulatory surgery center setting? Do you know if corneal tissue is bundled by your insurers or paid at all? Do you know which of the insurance companies that you deal with present challenges for your facility? And have you tried to renegotiate with those challenging insurance companies? Or have you just decided, I can't do my corneal transplants in certain settings, and moved your cases that involve corneal tissue to another location? So in order to have a discussion about corneal tissue contracting, we really have to do an overview of Medicare billing in general, just to give us some groundwork to talk about it a little bit further. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of ambulatory surgery center and hospital outpatient department billing under the Medicare program. Then we're going to discuss the commercial contract issues that you need to understand and review before performing corneal transplants in your ambulatory surgery center or in your hospital, but more of the contracting issues with commercial carriers are a problem in ambulatory surgery centers, so we'll focus a lot more on ambulatory surgery centers. We can discuss some specific corneal billing issues and hopefully clear away any misinformation about private and public payments, related to corneal transplants in your facilities. So why do we discuss Medicare billing? Basically, because Medicare is black and white. If you bill Medicare appropriately, you tend to get fair reimbursement without a lot of rejections and fighting and, calling the insurance company 100 times. So we want to make sure we understand that. If your facility is not getting their Medicare reimbursement, you're starting with a kind of problem at the base level. So very basic. Ambulatory surgery centers bill what's called Part B Medicare carriers for their services. Physicians in a doctor's office also bill Part B Medicare, while hospital outpatient departments bill Part A. So just talking about who has Part A and Part B, anyone who's worked in the United States is given Part A upon turning 65. Well, they have to pay into Part B to receive Part B benefits. So that's an important thing that, at the get-go, your front desk needs to make sure that these patients have Part B if you're in an ambulatory surgery center. And then Medicare will only reimburse a facility for procedures on the ASC approved list of procedures in a surgery center. And Medicare will pay 100% for the first procedure and 50% for the second, third, fourth, and fifth procedures. And the patient in an ambulatory surgery center billing Part B is responsible for 20% of what Medicare deems a service worth. So they have a 20% share in the total cost of the case. So corneal tissue in the Medicare program, both in an ambulatory surgery center and a hospital, is reimbursed at invoice cost plus a fee for processing and transportation. And that's separate from the procedural code that's reimbursed to your facility and to your doctor. So let's just look at what kind of dollars we're talking about. So Medicare facility rates are, pretty much the same for all the regular corneal transplant procedures like ALKs, PKs, and DSECs. And, you have all of our CPT codes, the regulars you're probably used to looking at, the 657 series of codes. In an ambulatory surgery center, for the CPT of the actual procedure done, you can receive $1,665, which is 56% of the hospital outpatient department rate of $2,967. One might say, gosh, that's a huge differential, but that's where ASC rates are set. Hospitals have to do all sorts of other things, so they do get more. And when you deal with the K-Pro, you have less of a differential. It's only 82% of the hospital outpatient department rate, and that's really because the $5,000 that they allocate for the K-Pro implant is the same rate either an ambulatory surgery center or a hospital outpatient department, and the amount above the $5,000 is really that differential. And then the corneal tissue, with any of the above CPTs, you're using corneal tissue, your facility should also submit a V code. The V2785 code should be also submitted on the facility claim for both a hospital and an ambulatory surgery center. And then Medicare will pay that at the pass-through rate, which is great. And some advancements like intralace-enabled keratoplasty, in the past, there was no ability to get extra reimbursement for those sorts of procedures, and we are seeing Medicare giving them new codes and recognizing that different techniques, are due additional reimbursement. So that's a good thing to watch. And there are some issues that come up when we start talking about secondary billing. So just to put those out there now, and then we'll go into the actual contracting issues. We talk about the Part A versus Part B Medicare issue, and remembering that a hospital is billing Part A, an ambulatory surgery center facility is billing Part B. Remember that that patient, when they go to the hospital, has 100% coverage. They don't owe 20% of that facility charge. They may owe 20% of the doctor charge, but they will not be subject to 20% of the facility charge. However, when you take them into an ambulatory surgery center, that 20% either falls to their secondary insurance or it becomes their personal responsibility. So when we're talking about 20% of an ambulatory surgery center bill of $1,665 plus, let's call corneal tissue $3,000 to make the math easy, we would have $4,600 that Medicare would deem the corneal transplant worth, and they're only going to pay 80% of that. So that patient could end up with, a significant personal responsibility of $900 that they would not have if you took that corneal transplant to the hospital. So that's something to pay attention to. And, if your patients don't have any secondary insurance, make sure they understand that they're going to be responsible for that. If they do have secondary insurance, a lot of them have sort of catastrophic coverage on their secondary and may, in fact, this 920% that when you're doing it in the ambulatory surgery center may land in the patient bucket. So those are important things to just be alert to. The other thing is sort of a technical bill processing issue. In the Blue world, we talk about Blue Cross Blue Shield. The Blue Cross and Blue Shield pretty much correspond to the Part A, Part B issue, although unfortunately not exactly. So a facility bills Blue Cross, a doctor bills Blue Shield. So you could think of Blue Cross as Part A and Blue Shield as Part B, except when you're dealing with ambulatory surgery centers. Ambulatory surgery centers with Medicare are Part B. Ambulatory surgery centers with the Blue program are actually Blue Cross. So there's a little disconnect when claims go where they have Medicare as a primary and they have Blue as a secondary. The ambulatory surgery center claim goes to the Part B Medicare carrier. They pay their 80%, and that 20% is supposed to cross over to Blue Cross or Blue Shield, but the Part B world likes to map to the Blue Shield world. They are not used to mapping to the Blue Cross world. So one of the problems we experienced in the Wills Eye ambulatory surgery centers was that Blue Shield received the V code for the corneal transplant tissue, and they didn't know what to do with it. They understand the CPTs because doctors have been billing those CPTs for corneal transplants to Part B for years, but they didn't know what to do with the V code for the corneal tissue because a doctor never bills corneal tissue. So we had to spend some time educating the carrier to get those claims crossed into the correct part of the world. In fact, it ended up staying in the Blue Shield world, but we got them to quit denying the V code as being a non-covered service under the Blue Shield plan, because in fact it was a covered service under the Blue Shield Medigap plan. So that's just something, you may or may not have that problem with your local Blue carrier, but that's something to be alert to and understand. So let's talk about contracting. There are 3 common types of contracting we're going to talk about. The first one, and the easiest one, is when you get a contract based on the Medicare fee schedules and on Medicare coverage policies. You know, this is good for 2 reasons. One, it makes it black and white. Medicare coverage policies are pretty black and white. We pay for the CPT and we pay for the corneal tissue, and we even are considering paying extra for new technologies over time. We're giving them codes to say that new technologies are worth an additional fee. So those are the types of things we like to see in a contract. And thankfully, Medicare, has been good to the corneal world. A great contract would be a Medicare fee schedule plus 20, 30, 40% and follow Medicare policies. This is the best practice. If you can get a commercial carrier to write a contract like this, you're in great shape if you're doing corneal transplants. So it is, in fact, from a corneal perspective, one of the safest contracts that you can write. Medicare policies theoretically account for increasing costs and differences in advances in surgical technology and obviously an increased cost in corneal tissue, since corneal tissue remains a pass-through with Medicare. So, number 1 is what we want. Number 2, it says Medicare payments are based, commercial carrier payments are based on that same Medicare fee schedule, except we're going to take a couple codes and carve them out. And you'd say, well, why would you want to do that? Unfortunately, it's not usually the provider or the facility that wants to do that. It's typically the carrier. So if they have to look at an invoice for corneal tissue on every single corneal transplant claim, it's just costing them more money and more time to process those claims. So what they'd like to do is say, okay, let's use that 657 code, and instead of paying it, what Medicare pays, the $1665, let's put a markup for the tissue included in that code. So we're going to carve out those codes, and we're going to pay those a little bit differently than Medicare. We're going to pay them much more to kind of account for the tissue. And that's great when you sign the contract if they put it high enough that it is the CPT plus what the V code would have been. The problem is that contracts aren't usually written year to year. They're usually written and they don't get reviewed for years on end. So if you write a contract like this, 1, you want to make sure it's written high enough to deal with prepared tissue that's being prepared for various reasons, for DSEC prepared tissue, for intralace-enabled keratoplasty, for imported tissue if you have some special case, et cetera. And so you want to make sure that you set that tissue cost high enough, and it's different in different parts of the country, so there's no given amount that you want to do, but look at your average cost of corneal tissue and make sure you set that high enough. But you also want to make sure that you write an escalation clause into the contract that says corneal tissue globally has gone up by 25% in the last 2 years. We need to have a talk because, at this point, it's costing us money to do these cases. So you want to make sure, 1, that that's in the contract, and 2, that you have someone that monitors that contract and calls them when it's time to kind of enable that part of the contract. Say, well, gosh, we need to bring that fee up to match the changing technology and costs that go along with that. The third contract is the one we really don't want as corneal transplant surgeons, but it happens. Basically, an ambulatory surgery center signs a contract where payments are based on the Medicare fee schedules, but no implants are covered. Implants are bundled in everything, and they haven't carved anything out. So if they had paid us 100% of Medicare, we'd be looking at $1665 as the total reimbursement for a corneal transplant with nothing else. And we'd be paying, I think, a lot more than $1665 for your corneal tissue. So you'd be paying to do these cases the minute you walk in the door, never mind overhead, et cetera. You'd be out of pocket the minute you walked in the door to do that transplant. So why would anyone sign this contract? Well, these contracts probably were in place long before the corneal transplant surgeons started doing their transplants in an ambulatory surgery center. These contracts, strayly, a hospital may have signed, but in general, hospitals have been doing corneal transplants, so they've probably been more alert to that. But in ambulatory surgery centers, often were developed by cataract surgeons. Busy cataract surgeons signed their contracts. They looked at how much it was How much was my reimbursement for a cataract? And they didn't care about that much more. And then over time, as ambulatory surgery centers became more the norm for doing ophthalmic surgery, they've taken more subspecialties into ambulatory surgery centers. And as that's happened, they haven't necessarily reviewed all those contracts before they bring these other surgeons on site. And so clearly a contract like this is not one where you'd like to be recruiting a lot of corneal transplant surgeons unless you can renegotiate. So what can we do? Ideally, number one, we want the Medicare pass-through. We want it as a multiple of Medicare, but we want to retain that pass-through for corneal tissue. 2 is okay, but it requires more monitoring and thought and analysis before you sign it. 3, if you're going to bring in a busy corneal transplant surgeon in a facility with a contract like the third one we discussed, where it's Medicare fee-based without carve-outs, you probably need to, renegotiate it or consider transferring those cases to a different setting, probably one of your hospitals locally. So what can you do? So we told you we're going to give you 20 minutes, something you can do. So the first thing is review your commercial contracts, and ideally before you start performing corneal transplants. Some of you may have already started performing corneal transplants and don't understand why you're not getting reimbursement on it. Someone needs to go back and read those contracts. How were they written? Which version did you end up signing? And if you've signed one that's unfavorable and you want to keep doing those corneal transplants in your facility, you need to be renegotiating. And there are some resources that can help you with renegotiating. The Ambulatory Surgery Center Association meetings are fantastic, a great place to learn kind of how all of this coding works and touch base with other people and see what their experiences are, et cetera. And probably one of the most important things to understand is that a contract is a whole package. There might be a reason that you have one of these unfavorable contracts that really isn't giving fair reimbursement to doing corneal transplants. However, you may be a facility that does so many cataracts and you only do a couple corneal transplants a month. And again, maybe you only do one here and there for this contract that doesn't work for corneal surgeons. And that contract might be very favorable for your other procedures that you do high volume of. So in general, when you're looking at a contract, you want to analyze the contract on a whole for the case mix that you have in your facility. So, this talk is really giving you a perspective on corneal transplants, but most ambulatory surgery centers don't just do corneal transplants. They do lots of other things. So understand that your facility might not be willing to, push the button for corneal transplants because it might impact their overall financial well-being. To fix that problem, they may end up losing more than they bargained for. But the other thing to remember, is that if you've got a contract like this and you choose to go forward in that facility, understand that facility has purchased that corneal tissue and it needs to pay the eye bank for that corneal tissue at the appropriate fee, even though they may not be globally getting a appropriate reimbursement from the contract. But it's a contract that the facility has signed, not a contract that the eye bank has signed. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. And then what else can you do? Advocate for your practice. Contact your provider representative and educate them. In my experience in contracting for ambulatory surgery centers, you often have someone on the other end of the phone with the insurance company that just doesn't understand these cases and the costs involved in them as much as you do. So when you lay out very logically the costs and show them that you can't expect us to be paying to do these cases, if you can get to a human being, you can often, get something done in that way. And also, you may need to talk to them about that weird claims processing blue issue if, your local blue is giving you any trouble with corneal tissue on those secondary claims. So again, that was an education process, just explaining the whole coding system and reimbursement to the local carriers, and they fixed it. And every now and then for those secondary claims, file a paper claim. Medicare, you can't file a paper claim. You got to transmit things electronically, and ideally we'd like to submit everything electronically because we get paid faster, but ultimately you may have to file paper claims and put some policy guidelines and show them that they're mispaying you. And then Site Life can help you with these issues. Just ask. They have resources and will be very happy to help you. So in conclusion, kind of saying it over and over, don't sign a contract without reading it closely and making sure you understand its effects on your facility. Your facility, may make choices because of the case mix that may not be great for corneal transplants, but make sure you understand what's in there before you start doing corneal transplants. Be willing to educate your carriers. and use your IBanks, to help you educate them. And, before you start a negotiation, I believe you should know the Medicare billing guides cold. Again, they're black and white. They don't leave a lot of gray in there. When I do billing consulting for ambulatory surgery centers or practices, the first thing I do is pull out their Medicare EOBs. And if they have a bunch of rejections on Medicare, I think someone just doesn't know the basic coding rules, because Medicare is easy. So you should know that one. Your business managers should know the Medicare billing guidelines cleanly, and they should be getting paid cleanly on their Medicare claims. Know your case costs. Being able to quote your case costs very comfortably to the person you're negotiating with is a great way to do it. Like, look, this is how much it costs me. Corneal transplants don't just cost corneal tissue and OR time. They, have a lot of disposable supplies like tree fines and things that are used up in the case that are not low cost. They're much higher cost cases than the average cataract that's being done in the surgery center, or even some of the plastics or muscle surgery. And then you have to be ready to let them know that if a fair deal isn't reached, they may be restricting their patients' access to care. So much ophthalmic care has been moved to ambulatory surgery centers at this point. Most surgeons feel more comfortable doing their cases in ambulatory surgery centers. The hospitals don't devote as much surgical time, operative time to them. It's easier and more efficient for them to do these cases in an ambulatory surgery center. So you want to point that out to them and tell them it's cheaper for them. I mean, if you look at, if they're using Medicare-based fee schedules, a hospital is going to be more expensive than an ambulatory surgery center. And trying to get that person on the other side of the table to understand, look, we're trying to do it more efficiently, less expensively for you, and better for your patient. And ultimately, if they won't talk turkey with you, we're talking about a contract, you may need to move your transplants to a different setting. It'll be more expensive for that insurance company. It might be a little bit of a hassle for you to have to take some of those cases to a different setting, but there are times when that just has to happen. So a couple questions, to answer. Do you get paid fully for all cases using corneal tissue? And K-Pros too. A lot of ambulatory surgery centers probably are not doing K-Pros, but if you are you getting paid for them? Do you have any of these carve-out cases? If you do you have escalation clauses? And is someone policing those, more importantly? And, do you have any contracts with no implants at all? And I'd probably tell you that I would bet many of your Medicaid carriers do not play implants at all, and you're probably losing money on Medicaid corneal transplants in an ambulatory surgery center. You may ask, why was that signed? And again, it's probably because they weren't doing corneal transplants when they signed some of these. And Medicaid, because you need to accept Medicaid if you're, whatever type of facility you might be. So, any questions you have regarding this? As we've said, SightLife is there to help you, and very specifically, Aaron Hayden, who has basically put this talk together with me, is the source to write to and ask your questions, and he and I will get back to you with any answers that we can get you. Thank you very much.